Greetings, class. We're going to discuss one of my most favorite biblical topics today, and that's the book of Revelation. I know a lot of folks are not sure what to make of the book. The language in it is just outrageous at times. The colors are so vivid. It seems to be about completely the future, and thus we're not sure exactly what we're looking at. And see, we even question whether John knew what he was looking at when he wrote it. And there's just a lot of questions on how to deal with it. What does it mean? It's so big in scope, and at times it can be very frightening and scary to even read. Most people want to assume that they will not be around when it happens because of the imagery and the persecution and the judgment of God that's there. And so I understand that sometimes this can be a hard read, and most people just simply avoid it. But I want you to know that Revelation chapter 1 verse 3 says, "Blessed are those who read the words of this prophecy." And I believe that to be true. It is a blessing to read this book. It's a blessing to be aware of it. How in the world can we even understand it, much less be aware of the blessing that the Spirit has promised we could have? Well, I want to try to give you some options on that today as we look through the notes. So take a very good look at your notes and then read the book of Revelation. I'm sure you've probably read it before, but I'm going to offer you some ideas on how to get a better reading on the book. So we're going to talk some about the background, try to set up the historical background of the book, look at some interpretive issues, how people have interpreted in the past and how people still interpret it today. Talk about some key terms and definitions that will help you kind of read your way through it. And then I'll provide an outline of the text in your notes, kind of help you to kind of see the flow of the story as it proceeds forward. So with that in mind, let's talk about what Revelation is as a genre or a style of writing. Revelation is apocalyptic. Now the ironic thing here is apocalyptic means to unveil or reveal. The reality is we look at it, we don't feel like anything's made more clear. We feel like it's murkier or more difficult after we've read it. But that's because we're separated by 2,000 years from the original writer, from the language he used, and from the images he used. I think they made a lot of sense to him. I think they made a lot of sense to the people who first read it. These were images that were very much in the Jewish culture, and apocalyptic was a style of literature. Revelation is not the only book written this way. There are many Jewish writings that claim to be visions from God, that have dragons and crazy colors and marching armies and wars to end all wars and upheaval in nature with earthquakes and red moons and black suns and everything, and all of nature being brought into chaos. So Revelation is not alone in its presentation. And what we need to realize is that it's a type of literature. It's a way of talking about God. And I think its intent is to give us an idea about the future. But I think its intent is also to paint a portrait of who Jesus Christ is when persecution comes. So when you look at apocalyptic, remember that it's supposed to unveil, but that it's also a type of literature that we're not familiar with anymore. Now, some of the things about apocalyptic that I just want you to note is that most of the time an apocalyptic writing does not have an author. It's not ever named, or it's given an Old Testament hero name like Moses or like Joseph or David or some popular name like that. Also, they are considered to be angelic revelations. The books that use apocalyptic literature claim that angels give them all of their information, which brings authority to the message. It claims that it's the end of all evil and the beginning of a new generation. All of these writings claim that those who remain faithful will be rewarded. So there's several characteristics across the board in apocalyptic literature that we can see what the authors were attempting to do was to encourage a group of people in times of persecution to remain faithful to the bitter end. Now, one thing about our book of Revelation is that we also accept it to be Christian prophecy. Now, defining prophecy can be tricky. Most of us think it's future telling. But to be honest with you, prophecy, first and foremost, is forth-telling, or giving the literal truth of God. And that truth can be about the past, the truth can be about the present, or the truth can be about the future. And many times, it covers several different layers of past, present, and future. So there's a lot of flexibility in interpreting prophecy, and the key for us is not to just take it and bend it however we want to bend it. But the key is understanding what God says to his people, and realizing that Revelation is an extension of the message that he's given before. If you know the Old Testament prophets, you'll be very familiar with this New Testament prophecy because the book draws on Old Testament prophecies. So keep that in mind as you read it. Again, speaking the truth, interpreting events, and emphasizing the gospel of Jesus. That's the key to New Testament prophecy, and that's the key to understanding Revelation, knowing that it's about Jesus and his message. So Revelation is in itself an apocalyptic prophecy. Make note of some of the details and some of the key terms in your notes as you think that process through, and that we're looking at it both in terms of its literary cover or its literary clothing and the content of it, which is prophecy underneath that apocalyptic clothing. Now, as you consider the book of John, we'll talk about authorship. Note the authorship. I think it's the Apostle John. Note the discussion on authorship. Note the date that it must be a book written during time of persecution. I don't think there's any doubt about that. So the question is whether it was written in 66 AD under the persecution of Nero or 95 AD under the persecution of Domitian. Both of those dates leave the possibility that John would still be alive for the writing. But in 95 AD, John would probably have been very old, perhaps in his 80s at that point in his life, which would have been very old for people in his day. Note the arguments for the dating in your notes, and just pay close attention to that. Also, there's a recipients and purpose of the letter. The book of Revelation itself, the purpose, I believe, is written to churches in a particular area in Asia Minor, surrounding or around the city of Ephesus and up and down the coastline in that particular area. So these 7 churches represent a close group of Christians in Asia Minor during the late 1st century AD. But notice that Revelation also depends a lot on symbolism, and the number 7 in apocalyptic literature is often used to discuss images of completeness or universality. Just like it took 7 days to complete the earth and rest for God, so also the number 7 represents anything else that God has done in completion. So with this number symbolism in mind for the book of Revelation, and we apply it primarily to Revelation only in these terms, we can see that every time the number 7 pops up, and that's 51 times in the book of Revelation, that in some way the author is trying to communicate something large or complete. So when we see 7 churches, we note that these were 7 historical churches in Asia Minor, but we also need to think that the author is probably trying to tell us that by listing 7 churches and the issues that those 7 churches are going through, that this vision is for every church in every age, in every state of faith, and that every message here applies for all Christians for all time. Not just our generation, but for every generation. So keep that in mind, that the purpose of the book was to encourage the original 7 churches, but also to encourage all churches for all time, based on the number 7 being symbolic. So as you keep that in mind, note some of the specific discussion on that. Now, we have some interpretation issues that we need to face, and I've put a slide there in your notes. Apocalyptic symbols, interpretive methods, the 7-fold judgments, and the millennium and the rapture. And we're going to talk about each of these in the notes, and I want you to take time to look through each one as you go through this. It's key that we understand the symbols of apocalyptic, and that they're more than just mere words, and they're more than just connections to individuals or things in the future. But each symbol carries weight and meaning within itself to communicate not just to our time, but to John's people, to John himself, the truth that God wanted them to know. So know that the symbols have more than just future meaning. The symbols have impact and meaning for John's time first, and for our time second. Note specifically the use of numbers and colors. It's very, very important for us as we read the book of Revelation to see how John uses numbers and colors to communicate more truth and about the vision that he has. Now, there are interpretive methods for the book of Revelation that I've listed. These are essential for you to know. Please go look at your notes and take a look at the future/dispensationalist method. And you can be a futurist without being a dispensationalist. And if you don't know what that is, take a look at the notes and that define it for you there. But note, that's the first one we talk about is future. The second one that we talk about is a philosophical/idealist interpretation. The next one is a preterist interpretation, and see the definition in your notes. And then finally, there's a continual historical method that many people have used. And then in addition to that, I said finally before, in addition to that, there's a historical background method, which is the method that I prefer. It's kind of a combination of several of these methods that looks for layers of interpretation, both past and future. And so keep that in mind as you look through your notes. You need to be aware of these 5 methods, and you need to know how to distinguish between them and define them. So pay special attention to that in your notes, please. I've also provided a look at the sevenfold judgments, how they work together, how they parallel one another, and their role within the vision, that John uses these judgments to build up our anticipation of the end. And as we see the events unfolding, we see a clear path to an end, but there are lots of unique ways to look at them, and I've provided some of those ways for you in the notes. And then finally, we need to talk about an issue that a lot of people want to talk about. That's the millennium and the rapture. And I'm going to give you a little hint here. I do believe there will be a millennium. I believe it says so in Revelation 20. I'm not so sure about a rapture. I can't find it in the book of Revelation. There's no place for a rapture listed in the book. But I do discuss, if you believe in a rapture, I do show you where you can have some options to place it in there. But the Revelation itself does not contain the idea of rapture. We get it from Paul's writings in 1 Corinthians, and even there, it's questionable what Paul means by the term. I've laid out some thinking and some processes on this, and of course I welcome any questions you may have about it. I'm not trying to change your mind. I'm simply trying to get you to look more closely at things you've been told all your life about this book and about how we need to believe in the end times. And just examine for yourself. Read the story. Where is this information? Where do you find it? Where do they find it? Are they really handling the Bible well? You've been given enough information in this class to go back and look at some of the things that these other speakers are saying, and at least ask the question, why is he saying that? Do I really agree with him? If you do, that's fine, no problem. Just know why you agree with him. And perhaps after thinking things through, you're going to come to a realization that I'm not sure I agree with all these things I've been told about this controversial book. And that's okay too. The key is knowing why you believe what you do and being able to defend it. And I hope you've been given enough information in this book as we've read through our notes together and as we walk this journey together in the New Testament. Hope you've been given enough information to be able to tell on your own some of these key issues and work through them. Revelation is a very difficult book. I wouldn't be surprised if after we're done with this, you've got more reading and more information you'll want rather than need. You'll want to find out more after we're done is what I'm trying to get at. So keep in mind that further study will always be needed, and I'm just hoping you'll have more information to do study with and to have a better grasp on what God is trying to say through this interesting and passionate book about God's dealing with humanity. Now, I've provided a thematic outline, and I hope you can see in the slide how this movement of the message goes forward from the introduction of Jesus in chapter 1 to the introduction of the churches in chapter 2 to the introduction of who God is in his throne room in chapter 4 to the opening of the scroll, to the reading of the scroll, to the introduction of God's enemies, to the final battle between God and his enemies, to the beginning of a new heaven and a new earth, and how this is the basic flow of the book. And regardless of the method of interpretation you choose, I think you can use this narrative outline to help you work through the vision and see where John was headed. In the final portion of the lecture, I want you to see some key themes. This is where I think Revelation becomes very powerful for us. When we see how Jesus is presented in the book, and we lose focus on what's going to happen at the end, and notice who Jesus is in the midst of this book, I think that's very powerful for us. Notice who we are, the people of God, in the middle of the book, and John, who he thinks he is in the middle of the book. And so see the people of God presented. See how the enemies of God are drawn up and pitted against the people of God and God himself. See the judgment of God, how it's presented, what key themes keep coming up over and over again, how it displays God's passion for what is right, and also what God's motive is for bringing this judgment. If you look closely, you'll see God is motivated by the persecution of his people. He's going to bring judgment on the world because they refuse to repent, and in fact, they are hurting his children. And if you can imagine the anger of a parent over his children being violated, you can begin to see the passion by which God's judgment comes. And it's not just a judgment bent on destroying sin, but it's a judgment that actually expresses redemption and love for those who have faith in him. So there's some very deep and powerful images and metaphors here concerning the judgment of God that goes way beyond just the destruction of the world we see, but it actually shows love for God's people in the midst of it. And then the new heaven and new earth. What can we expect out of it? How does John present what is coming to us? And in fact, we'll see connections between how John views heaven and how the author of Hebrews views heaven, and how the rest of the Old Testament views heaven, in terms of a tabernacle, in terms of God's presence, in terms of the restarting over of creation, that the new heaven and new earth are a renewing of God's intention from the very beginning. And thus we see continuity between Genesis and Revelation as God brings everything to a moment of crisis in order to begin it all again. And we'll see where we fall within the midst of that. So check out these key themes. This is where the beauty and the power of Revelation comes for us. And it's not all about the fulfillment of the future, but it is about who God is and who Jesus is in the midst of this very powerful and beautiful vision that John presents to us. So I hope you enjoy your reading. I know your head will be spinning a little bit afterwards, but I hope we also have some tools by which we can read and see some very powerful truths that God wants us to see. Because remember, blessed are those who read this prophecy. God intends for us to be blessed by it, and I hope you are blessed by it this week. Thank you. Have a great week. We'll see you on